So let's talk about the next requirement, which says to create a baseline for resources. Now, the concept of the baseline within Microsoft Azure is that you might have, if we go into the all resources section, you may have dozens and hundreds and maybe even 1,000 or more resources inside your Azure subscription. And if something was to happen to that, let's say someone was to go and delete all those resources, or something got really messed up and in a deployment and it started overwriting things and you didn't want them to, how would you recover from that besides, having backups of virtual machines and things like that? So the concept of the baseline is having each of your resources stored as either a script in the form of a Powershell script or a CLI, or stored as a template, an ARM template. Imagine if you did have all of the resources in your account stored in GitHub as an ARM template. That's the baseline. And then as you make changes to it, instead of going in here and modifying the resources directly, you modify the template and just redeploy the template. Okay, so that's what we want to eventually move to in a controlled manner, modifying your environment in a controlled manner. So how do you do this? Well, one thing you can do, I'm going to close out of this. We're going to go into a resource group. So I'm going to go into the AZ-SJD First Web App Resource Group. Now there's only 3 resources in here, but there's been 4 deployments. And if I go into the deployments section, either on the left or from the overview screen, I can see I originally deployed a Microsoft website on June 18th, and then I did it again June 21, Traffic Manager, and a network security group on September 2nd. So we can see how long it took, and we can see it succeeded and when it was done, etc. So one way to do the baseline would be to go into like this website view, and if I click on it, I can see the complete deployment. So there was a website and there was a service plan. I can go over here to template and I can see that deployment that happened, forgot the date already, on June 21st at 2:48 p.m. This is the deployment. This is the template of what Microsoft deployed. So there's the template, there's the parameters. I can download these and store them. Basically, then I'll have a baseline of this web app and the application service plan. Don't forget that you have to also store the parameters JSON file as well as the template. It takes 2 files for this to be useful. And then Microsoft provides 4 different scripts that you can use to redeploy this. If you wanted to, it will. It's a pretty standard PowerShell here. It takes the template JSON, the parameters JSON, and re-executes it. Okay. So you can download that. You can add this to your template library. So I'm going to say AZ100 free web app. And then you go in the description and you say this is a test of saving a deployment. You want this to be very rememberable and useful. When you do go into your template library and you have dozens and dozens and hundreds of templates, make sure that this is very clear as to what you're saving. You may want to have some type of naming scheme that you try to follow in terms of organization, right? So this can get saved to my templates library. I could also download it, put it into Git, for instance. Another thing I can do is I can redeploy it. And so I can rerun this ARM template, and if anything had changed with the resource, it would reset it back to the old settings. So if I'd upgraded the service plan to a new size, rerunning the deployment would reset that. And that's the concept behind desired state configuration and automation. So by rerunning the deployment, Azure ensures the resources fit into the parameters that we're setting. So that's one way to do it, is you can just go find that deployment that contained the resources that you want to save and save it. Now another thing that you can do, let's go back to the overview here, is you can go to each of the individual resources. So I'm going to go into the app service and I can find an automation tab. So there's an automation script tab in this resource. And Microsoft is generating right now, as I clicked it, it's generating a fresh copy of the current state of this resource. So remember that when I did the deployment in June, which was 4 months ago, I could have changed this resource many times. I could have scaled up. I could have added things, used the portal, non-deployment things or future deployments. The automation script is trying to capture it as of this exact moment. Okay, again, templates, parameters, and then 4 options in terms of scripting. Now, I should put the caveat here. The caveat is that not every resource that Microsoft offers is available to be generated using the automation script and to be into this deployment file. And so while most times it will work, you might find that sometimes there'll be a resource that was unable to be generated and it's dependent, other resources are dependent on it. So this is this is not a perfect baselining strategy. It's good, but there are sometimes resources that might not be covered properly in this. Okay, so that's generating the automation script, which will grab this resource. Now, this is not, the deployment happens at the resource group level. This is the individual resource in case of the automation script, although you can see, because there's a dependency, that you can see that the service plan's in here, the network security group is in here as well. Okay, so it seems to handle other related resources. Now let's go actually take that a moment to go into the deployments, what's called templates. So if we go into all services and templates, we can see the free web app that we just created, right? So when we went into the resource group and we wanted to save that deployment, the template has been saved here. Okay, so if we need to redo this, we can redo it. We can redeploy it, for instance, from this section. Okay, so those were 2 ways to baseline your environment using ARM templates. Now, the other way that we can baseline our environment is to create PowerShell scripts. Now, so if we go into the PowerShell examples as a good example, if anytime you go into Azure documentation, you should be able to find PowerShell examples. We could obviously create PowerShell scripts that basically will recreate our environment. Now, this is much more of a manual task, right? So we're going to have to, Microsoft doesn't automatically generate PowerShell scripts from our existing environment, but we certainly could take a sample script like this, creating a virtual machine one, might be a more complicated one, and then get our values, right? Our resource group name, our location, our VM name, etc. So creating virtual machine scripts from scratch could be one way, and then you store that in your repository, your GitHub, and then you would need to enforce that only PowerShell scripts can be done to make changes to your deployment, to your environment, and then that gets incrementally stored. So obviously ARM templates is the supported way, and it's also great because it'll do the delta for you, it'll do the desired state configuration for you. But PowerShell scripts is certainly one way to sort of document your environment in a permanent way, that you'll be able to recreate that into a new region, or if some disaster was to happen, recreate your entire environment based on the scripts that you've been keeping up to date.